It was a sweltering summer day in the bustling city of Hiroshima, Japan. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the streets below. In a small classroom at Hiroshima High School, a young girl named Akiko sat alone, her eyes downcast and her shoulders hunched. Akiko was a recent transfer student, and she stood out like a sore thumb among her classmates. While they donned the latest fashions and carried sleek smartphones, Akiko preferred the traditional kimono and had little interest in modern technology. Her hobbies, too, were considered strange by her peers. She spent her free time practicing calligraphy and origami, skills that were seen as outdated and irrelevant in the fast-paced world of the 21st century. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the school day, Akiko braced herself for the inevitable. The other students, led by the class queen bee, Yuki, began to snicker and whisper behind their hands, casting judgmental glances in Akiko's direction. "Look at her, dressed like she's from the Edo period," Yuki sneered, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her desk. Akiko felt her face flush with embarrassment, but she refused to let her tears fall. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more abuse. Throughout the day, the taunts and jeers continued. Yuki and her cronies made fun of Akiko's calligraphy, mocking her delicate brushstrokes and elegant characters. They laughed at her origami creations, dismissing them as childish and pointless. Akiko tried to ignore them, focusing instead on her studies and the comfort she found in her traditional hobbies. But the constant barrage of insults and exclusion took its toll, and she found herself retreating further and further into her shell. As the weeks passed, Akiko's isolation only deepened. She ate her lunch alone, her bento box filled with carefully prepared dishes that no one else seemed to appreciate. She walked home alone, her footsteps echoing on the empty streets. One day, as Akiko sat in her usual spot by the window, watching the world go by, she felt a sudden surge of anger. Why should she be the one to change, to conform to the expectations of her classmates? Her traditions were just as valid, just as important as their modern ways. Akiko's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She thought of the gods of her ancestors, the ones who had guided her people through centuries of hardship and change. Surely they would understand her plight, her desire to be true to herself in the face of such overwhelming pressure to conform. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the city, Akiko made her way to the local Shinto shrine. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the sound of wind chimes echoed through the quiet courtyard. Akiko's footsteps were soft and hesitant as she approached the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, and poured out her heart to the gods. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Give me the strength to stand up to my tormentors and show them the beauty and value of my traditions." Akiko thought of the intricate patterns on her kimono, the delicate strokes of her calligraphy brush, and the intricate folds of her origami creations. She knew that her traditions were more than just outdated relics of the past. They were a part of her heritage and her identity. As Akiko rose to her feet, she felt a strange sensation wash over her. It was as if the gods had heard her plea and were responding. A gentle breeze ruffled her hair, and a single cherry blossom petal drifted down from the nearby tree, landing on her outstretched palm. Akiko looked up at the altar, her eyes wide with wonder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I will not let you down." As Akiko made her way back to her apartment, her mind raced with possibilities. What would the gods have in store for her? Would they give her the power to defeat her tormentors once and for all? But as she reached her door, a strange sensation overcame her. It was as if the air itself was charged with electricity, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Akiko turned around, her eyes searching the empty street. And then, she saw them. Two figures standing in the shadows, their faces obscured by the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figures stepped forward, and Akiko gasped. They were not human, but rather two ethereal beings, their bodies shimmering with an otherworldly light. "We are the gods you have called upon," one of them spoke, their voice echoing through the night. "We have heard your plea and are prepared to grant your wish." Akiko felt a surge of hope rise within her. "Please, help me," she begged. "Show me how to defeat my tormentors and prove the worth of my traditions." The other figure raised a hand, silencing her. "Be careful what you wish for, child," they warned. "For the gods work in mysterious ways, and the consequences of our actions are not always what they seem." Akiko felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have asked us to help you start anew," the first figure replied. "And so it shall be. But be warned, the path ahead will not be an easy one, and the price you pay may be greater than you can imagine." And with those words, the figures vanished, leaving Akiko alone in the darkness. She stood there for a moment, her mind reeling with the weight of their warning. What did they mean? The price you pay may be greater than you can imagine. Akiko shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She had to trust in the gods, in their wisdom and their power. As she turned and headed inside, a single tear rolled down her cheek. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to see it through. For the sake of her traditions, for the sake of her own identity, she would face whatever challenges lay in store. The next day at school, Akiko walked with her head held high. She ignored the snickers and whispers, focusing instead on her studies and her hobbies. And when Yuki and her friends tried to taunt her, Akiko simply smiled and walked away. But Akiko's newfound confidence only seemed to anger her classmates further. They began to escalate their attacks, shoving her in the hallways and knocking her books out of her hands. Akiko refused to retaliate, however, knowing that violence would only lead to more violence. One day, as Akiko was walking home from school, she heard a strange rumbling sound in the distance. It started as a low hum, barely audible over the sounds of the bustling city. But as she walked, the rumbling grew louder and more insistent, like the roar of a distant storm. Akiko looked up at the sky, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. And then she saw it, a strange object hovering high above the city, its metallic surface glinting in the afternoon sun. As she watched, a bright light began to emanate from the center of the object, growing brighter and brighter with each passing second. Akiko felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that something was terribly wrong. She began to run, her kimono billowing out behind her as she raced through the crowded streets. But it was too late. The light grew so bright that it seemed to fill the entire sky, blotting out the sun and casting everything in an eerie, otherworldly glow. Akiko felt a searing heat wash over her, and then everything went white. Akiko awoke to a world of chaos and destruction. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning flesh, and the sound of sirens and screams filled the air. She found herself lying amidst a pile of rubble, her kimono torn and her face streaked with soot. As she struggled to her feet, Akiko looked around in horror at the devastation that surrounded her. Buildings had been reduced to piles of twisted metal and shattered glass, and bodies lay strewn across the ground, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Akiko felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized what had happened. The bright light in the sky, the searing heat, it had all been the result of a nuclear bomb, dropped from the strange object that had hovered above the city. She stumbled through the rubble, her feet crunching on broken glass and debris. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional moan or whimper from the injured and dying. Akiko felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. As Akiko made her way through the devastation, she realized that her prayers had been answered, but not in the way she had expected. The gods had not intervened to help her, but rather to wipe the slate clean and start anew. She thought back to her plea at the Shinto shrine, her desperate wish to prove the worth of her traditions and defeat her tormentors. And now, as she looked around at the smoking ruins of her beloved city, she realized that the gods had taken her words literally. Akiko felt a strange sense of relief wash over her, mixed with a deep sense of guilt and sorrow. She had always known that her traditions were important, that they were worth fighting for. But now she realized that sometimes the only way to truly preserve what you love is to let go of the past and embrace the future. As she walked through the rubble, Akiko made a silent vow to herself. She would rebuild not just the physical structures of Hiroshima, but the spirit of her people. She would show them that tradition and modernity could coexist, that there was beauty and value in both. And as she looked up at the sky, where the strange object had once hovered, Akiko felt a sense of purpose and determination take root within her. She would not let the sacrifice of her fellow citizens be in vain. She would honor their memory by building a better future, one that embraced the best of both the old and the new. And so, Akiko set to work, her hands calloused from the labor but her heart filled with hope. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was determined to see it through. For in the ashes of Hiroshima, she had found a new purpose: to show the world that even in the darkest of times, there was always a glimmer of light.